Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Before we begin, let me wish everyone a very happy Ganesha festival. And tomorrow, on the account of the festival, we won't be having the Hindu analysis and as well as the daily quiz. Then, even on Saturday, our CNA and daily quiz will depend on the availability of the newspaper because usually the Hindu doesn't publish on the account of the Ganesha festival. So, with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column deals with the topic of green hydrogen and how, as an alternative source of energy, it can drive the industrialized world towards a zero carbon future. See, in November, the 26th Conference of Parties to the Climate Change Convention is all set to be held at Glasgow. So, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the topmost priority is the world's climate vulnerability, which has been clearly brought out by the latest IPCC report. So, governments around the world are racing towards decarbonizing their economies in order to avert and mitigate a climate disaster and achieve the ambitious target under the Paris Agreement of keeping the global rise in temperatures to under 2 degrees Celsius. So, in the pursuit of this goal, the key objective is to replace fossil fuels which are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, the world is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and according to IPCC estimates, every year 830 million tons of carbon is released into the atmosphere. It is this large scale emission of greenhouse gases which is directly contributing to global warming, and as we are witnessing, it is already driving extreme weather events around the world, which makes us all the more vulnerable to the impact of climate change. So, the only long term solution to this is for the world to move away from fossil fuels and quickly adopt alternative sources of energy that are cleaner and renewable. And one such potential alternative source of energy is hydrogen. Around the world, governments are focusing on replacing fossil fuels with hydrogen, as it is considered to be a clean fuel which can help us limit the emissions of greenhouse gases. See, hydrogen is the most abundant element found in the world. But however, for us to use it as a source of energy, we would require hydrogen to be present in its pure form. But in nature, hydrogen rarely occurs in its pure form, and it is present only in complex compounds such as water and other hydrogen based compounds. So, this requires us to extract hydrogen from these complex compounds for it to be used as a source of energy. Hydrogen is considered to be the most appropriate candidate because its energy density is nearly 3 times that of diesel, and this gives great potential for hydrogen to become the future source of energy. But however, in extracting this hydrogen and in making use of its energy potential, there are a lot of technical challenges that are involved. These technical challenges directly translate to increased costs, thereby making it difficult to adopt hydrogen as a fuel. First, the hydrogen will have to be compressed, and for this, liquid hydrogen has to be kept at a stable minus 253 degrees Celsius. This is far below the temperature of minus 163 degrees Celsius that is needed for liquefied natural gas. Then the other challenge is with regard to the type of energy that we should be using for extracting hydrogen. If hydrogen has to be extracted in its pure form from the complex compounds, then we need to drive a few reactions which will require energy. And all of this poses not only technical challenges but also economic challenges, because the increased cost of production will make it difficult for the wider adoption of hydrogen as a fuel. So, technically speaking, hydrogen by itself is not a source of energy. It is more of an energy carrier, and only when you produce or extract hydrogen from the complex compounds, and only when you are able to store it at stable temperatures, only then hydrogen can be used as an energy source. Hence, experts often refer to hydrogen as an energy carrier. Then also with regard to the production of hydrogen, there are different methods that are employed, and there are different sources of energy that are used to drive the production of hydrogen. So depending on the type of energy used and depending on the production method that is employed, hydrogen is classified and categorized into different groups, and hence we have these different color-coded forms of hydrogen. For example, we have blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, pink hydrogen, yellow and brown, but primarily the world is focused on green hydrogen. See, for example, in producing blue hydrogen, natural gas is split into hydrogen and carbon dioxide by using steam methane or autothermal reforming. So in the process of producing blue hydrogen, carbon dioxide is produced, but it can be captured and then stored. For the capturing process, carbon capture, usage and storage technologies can be used, that is essentially carbon sequestration. But such blue hydrogen is not an ideal candidate for decarbonizing the world because it is essentially produced using natural gas. Then in producing grey hydrogen, a similar process is employed where CO2 is released. So to prevent this CO2 from escaping into the atmosphere, it has to be captured by using different carbon capture technologies. Whereas pink hydrogen, on the other hand, is produced via the process of electrolysis, but it makes use of nuclear energy. Even though pink hydrogen is cleaner as compared to blue and grey hydrogen, employing nuclear energy for driving the electrolysis process carries its own risks, and hence even this is not the most viable candidate. Then we also have black hydrogen and brown hydrogen, which are produced using fossil fuels. Then again, this defeats the very purpose of decarbonization, and hence even these are not the ideal candidates. Yellow hydrogen, on the other hand, is produced using electrolysis, and the energy used to drive the electrolysis is solar power, which is clean and renewable. But the most appropriate form of hydrogen that can help us decarbonize the world is green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is produced by splitting water molecules, that is H2O, by employing the process of electrolysis. And to achieve this electrolysis, we need electricity, we need energy, which comes purely from renewable sources of energy such as solar and as well as from wind. And the byproduct of this electrolysis reaction would be hydrogen in its purest form and oxygen. And this oxygen that is released can be directly let off into the atmosphere without any environmental impact. Hence, green hydrogen is considered to be a zero carbon fuel, and hence this form of hydrogen is the focus for governments around the world. Even under India's National Hydrogen Mission, which was recently launched by the Prime Minister during the Independence Day, green hydrogen has been given the topmost priority to drive India towards a zero carbon future. See, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, the production cost of green hydrogen is quite high as of now. This cost is expected to be around $1.5 per kilogram, provided if those countries have perpetual sunshine throughout the year and vast tracts of unused land. So countries which have these resources can aim to produce green hydrogen at reasonable costs, but it is going to take some more time to bring down the production cost and make it more widely acceptable. If widely adopted, by the year 2030, the cost of hydrogen, that is green hydrogen, can be brought down to $1.5 per kilogram, which would then make economic sense to be widely used across the industry. So as the global population is growing at a fast rate, the need for energy will keep rising, and there is an urgent requirement to replace fossil fuels with such clean alternative forms of fuel. Especially for countries like India, adoption of green hydrogen is critical to decarbonize our future and as well as to shield against the impact of climate change. See, after China, US and European Union, India is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Very soon, India is expected to overtake the European Union. So considering the disastrous consequences of climate change, it is of utmost priority for countries like India and as well as for large polluters around the world to quickly shift towards adopting green hydrogen as an alternative source of energy. In India, the Indian Railways is already making a beginning in this regard, and it has recently announced the country's first hydrogen fuel cell train. In this initial project, an existing diesel engine would be retrofitted with a hydrogen fuel cell, which will be used to run a train between Sonepat and Jind in order to reduce the consumption of diesel. Then even fossil fuel producing countries like Saudi Arabia are trying to make a switch towards hydrogen, and Saudi Arabia has already launched an ambitious project to set up massive solar power plants in the northwestern part of the country to power the electrolysis reaction needed for the production of green hydrogen. So on similar lines, such ambitious initiatives will have to be taken up by countries like India and other large emitters of greenhouse gases in order to help the world in achieving its decarbonization goals. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that deals with the topic of reservation. See, we have spoken about reservation and affirmative action multiple times in our previous classes. If you remember, I've explained that reservation can be a tool through which the government can carry out social engineering. That is, reservation can be used as a policy option to provide for social mobility, wherein, through the system of quotas and preferential treatment, the oppressed and the marginalized sections of the society can be uplifted and they can be provided an opportunity, that to a fair opportunity, to move up the social ladder. So oppressed and marginalized sections, such as lower castes, and the disadvantaged sections of the society, such as the disabled, the economically poor, etc., can be socially empowered by reserving adequate number of seats for them in education and as well as in jobs. So reservation as a policy tool serves an important social purpose that helps in the upliftment of the marginalized sections. But unfortunately, this policy tool has been misused politically, primarily for creating a vote bank and for electoral gains, or either to cover up the failure of the government by offering reservation as a kind of a compensation for the marginalized sections. Essentially, reservation has become a tool for populism and populist politics, and political parties compete against each other in competitive populism, where they try to create more quotas and more reservation, either in order to cover up their governance failure or by keeping an eye on the electoral gains. Take, for example, the questionable quota policy that has been proposed by the Odisha government. Recently, Odisha has proposed a 15% reservation for those students who study in government schools when they seek entry into medical and engineering colleges. So for higher education in these technical fields, the state government is trying to create a 15% reservation for students who would have studied in government schools. The logic offered by the government for this policy is that students who would have studied in government schools are at an inherent disadvantage as compared to students who study in private schools. The state government has justified this policy by stating that students studying in government schools lack physical and economic access to coaching institutions, and hence, as per the government, they won't be able to compete for medical and engineering seats on their own merit. But the writer of this column strongly criticizes the state government and points out that this defense of the government defies all logic, because it is the primary duty and responsibility of the government, that is the state, to provide for accessible and inclusive quality education as a public good. Ideally, state-run schools should provide for high-quality education, and ideally, studying in government schools should have been the ideal option, not just for the students but even for the parents. But in the case of India, a huge divide has emerged between our government institutions and private institutions. And even though a majority of Indian students study in government schools, it is the private educational institutions which are the most sought after by students and as well as by parents. According to estimates, around 62% of the students in the country study in government schools, whereas around 38% study in private schools. Only a small percentage of them study in elite private institutions, which are usually located in urban centers, whereas a majority of these private institutions are actually substandard institutions. These elite private schools are inaccessible and unaffordable for the lower sections of the society, and yet there is a countrywide demand and obsession with private educational institutions. The blame for this doesn't lie with the students or the parents, but rather it lies with the government. The Indian state, that comprises of the central government and the state governments, they have clearly failed in their responsibility and in their duty for providing high quality education in government institutions. And in the case of Odisha, the state government is simply trying to cover up for its failures by resorting to populist tools such as reservation. See, today, if students who study in government schools find it difficult to compete with other students, and if they find it difficult to gain entry into elite institutions of higher education, or if they find it difficult to crack competitive exams, it's mainly because the state has failed them as it has not been able to improve the quality of education in government schools. For example, if you just look at Odisha, a few decades back, students from Odisha were doing really well in national level competitive exams. But of late, this trend has reversed, and it is mainly a result of the deteriorating quality of education in the schools of Odisha, especially in the government schools. So ideally, the government should be trying to take responsibility for this, and the right approach would be to promote quality education in government institutions. But instead, governments take the easier route because they are driven by the politics of populism, and they try to cover up for their governance failures by using reservation as an electoral tool. Instead, what they should be doing is to introduce education reforms by giving exclusive focus on government institutions, and they need to prioritize teachers' training and ensure that good quality teachers are recruited to fill the vacancies. The government should take the lead to adopt new pedagogic practices in government institutions and improve the teaching methods and techniques by providing the right kind of training to the teachers. The government should focus on implementing the new education policy and emphasize language training and language teaching, and focus on creating better infrastructure in our schools by providing the right kind of technological implements and aids, along with making rural and remotely located schools more accessible by providing the right kind of connectivity for the students. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that deals with a rare genetic disorder known as the Fragile X syndrome or FXS. This is considered to be the leading cause for inherited autism around the world. This genetic disorder, which leads to a rare disease, was not known until 3 decades ago. This syndrome occurs as a result of a genetic mutation, which was discovered by 3 American geneticists, Ben Ustra, David Nelson, and Stephen Warren. They named the syndrome as FRXA, and today it is known as the Fragile X syndrome or FXS. It is caused by a genetic mutation which occurs in a gene known as the fMRI. This genetic mutation inhibits the synthesis of a key protein known as the FMRP. The production and synthesis of this protein is absolutely critical for brain development. So those who are born with this genetic mutation are affected by inherited autism. So this essentially leads to a behavioral condition where the affected person suffers from symptoms such as learning difficulty, delay in speech, aggressive behavior, hyperactivity, attention deficit, fear of the unfamiliar, sensory processing disorders, and as well as problems in motor skills. According to estimates, around 4% of the population worldwide who suffer from autism, the leading cause would be FXS or the Fragile X syndrome. This syndrome affects a few individuals directly, whereas many others, they just carry the mutated gene and they pass it on to their children. According to studies, 1 in every 7,000 males and 1 in every 11,000 males tend to suffer from this syndrome, either as a directly affected person or as a carrier. In India, studies have estimated that around 4 lakh individuals are directly affected by FXS, which leads to inherited autism, and at least around 4 million Indians are undiagnosed carriers who are carrying the mutated gene, who then pass it on to their children. If the mother is a carrier of this mutated gene, then there is a 50% chance that she might pass it on to her children. And these children might be either directly affected by FXS related autism, or they might only become carriers who in turn transmit this to their children. Whereas in case of the father, the mutated gene is not inherited by the son, whereas it can be inherited only by daughters. So if the medical community, that is the doctors and the general public, are aware of this genetic inheritance and the way in which it transmits from one generation to another, it will enable earlier detection and as well as adequate family planning. But unfortunately, even after several years after the syndrome was discovered, there is still a lack of awareness about this syndrome, not just amongst the public, but even amongst the doctors in the medical fraternity. This genetic syndrome can be detected through a simple DNA test, which costs around 4,000 to 7,000 rupees. But unfortunately, the lack of awareness leads to poor diagnostics. And as the disorder goes undetected and undiagnosed, it enables the carriers to continue transmitting the gene to the next generations. And it also prevents the early detection of the disorder amongst young children who could be provided the right kind of therapy, at least to improve the individual's quality of life. Better awareness and better diagnosis can also provide the right kind of advice to couples with regard to family planning. And if it is known that one of the parent is carrying the gene, they can even take adequate precautionary measures in family planning. In India, there is a very poor understanding of this genetic disorder, and it wasn't really addressed under the National Policy for Treatment of Rare Diseases of 2017. This policy suffered due to poor implementation. But now, the National Policy for Rare Diseases Act has been brought out, and under this legislation, even though FXS has not been specifically mentioned, the government is pushing for systematic epidemiological studies and mandatory prenatal tests in case of known genetic disorders. In the US, for example, it is mandatory for a FXS test if a child has been diagnosed with autism. Such diagnosis will help the parents at least to avoid having further children, and this is currently missing in India because of poor awareness amongst both the public and the doctors, which is resulting in poor diagnosis. Next, we have a few small articles that provide us with important updates. According to this article on page number 8, the government of India has entered into a ceasefire agreement with one of the factions of the NSCN. The NSCN, or the National Socialist Council of Nagaland, is a dreaded insurgent outfit of the Northeast. This insurgent group was formed in 1980, and over the years, it has splintered into multiple factions. We have NSCN-IM, or the NSCN Isaac Muiwa faction, which signed a framework agreement in 2015, and currently it is negotiating with the Government of India to work out a Naga peace accord. Then we have the NSCN-K, or the NSCN Kaplang faction, which continues to be in a state of war against India, and by establishing a safe haven in Myanmar, it continues to target India. Then there are many other minor factions, one of which is the NSCN-K Niki group. It's one of the sub-factions of the Kaplang group. So this branch of the NSCN has signed a ceasefire agreement with the Government of India, and the cadres have surrendered along with their weapons. This group has agreed to join the ongoing Naga peace process, for which negotiations are taking place between the Government of India and several Naga insurgent groups, including the Isaac Muiwa faction and other Naga political representatives. So the NSCN-K Niki group would also be joining the ongoing peace process, along with the other Naga factions which have also signed ceasefire agreements, such as the NSCN-NK, NSCN-R, NSCN Kaplang Congo faction, etc. This comes in the backdrop of similar ceasefire agreements that the Indian government has signed with several other Northeast insurgent groups. For example, in August 2019, the Indian government signed an accord with the National Liberation Front of Tripura, or the NLFT, and its faction known as the Sabir Debarma faction. Then last year in January, the Government of India worked out the third Bodo Agreement, or the third Bodo Accord, through which the NDFB, or the National Democratic Front of Bodoland, surrendered, thereby providing for the mainstreaming of the Bodo movement. Then in February, the Karbi underground groups of Assam have also surrendered following the signing of the Karbi Anglong Agreement. So the signing of such ceasefire agreements will help in stabilizing the situation, the security situation in the northeast. And this particular agreement with the NSCN Kaplang Niki group will be a boost to the ongoing Naga peace process. Next, according to this article on page number 9, India and Russia have reviewed the current situation in Afghanistan in a high-profile meeting between India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and Russia's top security official, the Secretary of the Russian Security Council, General Nikolai Patrushev. During this visit of the top Russian security official to India, both the sides have discussed the emerging security situation in Afghanistan, including India's concerns about terrorism that emanates from the Afghanistan-Pakistan belt. These talks are crucial for India because Russia has already built its connections with the Taliban, and Russia could possibly help India in securing its interests in Afghanistan, including its security interests. This visit of the Russian official comes in the backdrop of other similar high-profile visits, including the visit of the CIA chief to India, Mr. William Burns, and the visit of the chief of MI6, which is Britain's external intelligence agency. So the top officials of CIA and MI6 have recently visited India and held a security dialogue with India with special focus on the current situation in Afghanistan. In this backdrop, the top Russian security official has also paid a visit to India to discuss the security situation in Afghanistan and how it affects the interests of both India and Russia. This visit also helps both the countries to coordinate their position at the UN Security Council because Russia is a permanent member of the P5 and India until 2022 is a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. Plus, this interaction would have also helped India and Russia to coordinate their position for the upcoming BRICS summit. Next, according to this article on page number 10, the Government of India has constituted a committee for framing a law to regulate drugs, cosmetics and medical devices. This committee would be headed by the Drugs Controller General of India, V.G. Somani, along with senior officials from other ministries and departments. And this committee has been mandated with the task of drafting a new bill on drugs, cosmetics and medical devices. Next, according to this article on page number 10, India and Australia are all set to hold their first ever 2+2 ministerial dialogue. See, the 2+2 dialogue is a diplomatic format where the defense minister and foreign minister of two countries interact simultaneously. It provides an opportunity for the defense and foreign ministers of the two countries to discuss the foreign policy and security issues that are affecting the interests of both the nations. India has established a similar 2+2 ministerial dialogue with many other countries, including US, Japan, and as well as with Russia. So now by holding a similar dialogue with Australia, the Quad countries would have established a 2+2 ministerial dialogue amongst themselves. And India and Australia would like to make use of this opportunity to mainly talk about the maritime security issues in the Indo-Pacific region, which is their priority focus area. And they shall also focus on cybersecurity and the current situation in Afghanistan. This high-level engagement in geopolitics and in the security domain between India and Australia is a part of their comprehensive strategic partnership, and it would add further momentum to their trade and economic relations as well, because India and Australia are even pursuing a bilateral free trade agreement, and both the countries are very much interested in accelerating these talks. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: illustrate how green hydrogen can lead us towards a zero carbon future. The second question: reservation is a tool for social engineering, but is often wrongly applied as a result of competitive populism. Discuss with a relevant example. Kindly write your answers to these questions and post your answers on the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.